We'd like to thank our briefers today for their stirring and substantive statements. However, we will be honest, we were a little surprised that in the briefings of UN high officials, the issue of terrorism was referenced just in passing. Recently, the Council has been paying increasing attention to this topic, and we would expect this from UN officials as well. Madam President, for 4 years, the armed conflict in Syria has brought the Syrian people untold suffering and become a cause of a humanitarian disaster. We highly value the steps taken by the international humanitarian community to alleviate this suffering. The government of Syria has to solve a difficult task, providing full-scale humanitarian assistance to populations in the territory they control. Neighbors of Syria, Lebanon, Turkey, and Jordan are hosting the largest number of refugees and providing for their needs. Russia provides the people of Syria with humanitarian assistance bilaterally. We attach great priority to the humanitarian issue in Syria, here on the Security Council, as well as on the ground, where the Embassy of Russia in Damascus every day is in contact with UN humanitarian agencies, as well as the Syrian government. The plan of humanitarian response needs donor support. We pay due tribute to the government of Kuwait for the convening of a donor conference, unfortunately where the Syrian government wasn't invited, while the needs of the population of the country for humanitarian assistance is at 3/4 covered by the government of the Syrian Arab Republic itself. We note that recently the Syrian government took a number of additional steps in the humanitarian field. The UN received the green light for the provision of humanitarian assistance for the majority of the 33 locations requested by the UN. There was an exception of 8 locations, 5 of which UN staff itself does not wish to send convoys for security reasons. It's known that in the territory controlled by the government, there is no significant lack of essential items, and medical institutions are working. With respect to opposition-held areas, there's a lack of a system for the provision of basic services to the population, with all ensuing harmful consequences. Equally imperative, of equal importance, is that on the humanitarian issue in Syria, the Security Council stick to a unified approach demonstrated by the unanimously adopted resolutions and statements, including the PRST today. An important indicator of such unity was the approval last year of the transport of humanitarian access to Syrians in need through crossing points on the borders with Turkey and Jordan. Unfortunately, the provision of humanitarian assistance through these crossing points is still very problematic, due in part to the whims of terrorists. We call upon humanitarian players in Syria to better coordinate in humanitarian assistance with Damascus. Madam President, any impartial observer would see clearly that today terrorism is the essential issue and threat in Syria. Terrorism is bringing the most suffering to people in Syria. The position of the international community with respect to terrorists is enshrined in Security Council resolutions 2170, 2178, and 2199. Terrorists, according to the Secretary General, have waged war on the values of the UN and its member states. Hundreds of thousands of people arbitrarily find themselves in the hands of barbarous so-called caliphates, cut off from humanitarian assistance. And on these territories, it's impossible to truly assess the humanitarian needs. The presence of the most odious terrorist groups, the Islamic State, Jabhat al-Nusra, is noted in almost all regions: Raqqa, Deir al-Azor, the south of Haseka, and the outskirts of Aleppo, Idlib, and eastern Ghouta. Recently, the Jabhat al-Nusra in Deraa led to 60,000 IDPs, and in Idlib, 77,000. In an attempt to spread its influence, these terrorist organizations are creating alliances, and this is a dangerous trend. Of particular concern is the attempt of terrorists to intervene in the Palestinian conflict, in particular taking the Syrian camp for Palestinian refugees in Yarmouk. We call upon all sides to ensure the security of civilians. We support the combat against the Islamic State as well as against other terrorist groups. Only a final eradication of jihadist fighters in Syria will allow for a normalcy of life to return to the country. We think that the trend of events in Syria requires emergency measures to ensure the protection of the country from terrorist aggressions and instating unity. Russia, from the very beginning, has called for the implementation of local truces or freezes in Syria. We're convinced that, indeed, effective humanitarian actions, including in line with Security Council resolutions, are only possible with a truce. We call upon the UN and humanitarian organizations to more actively engage in achieving local agreements and to do more to rebuild destructed infrastructure and establish normal life in residential areas. Madam President, in conclusion, I'd like to look at the root causes of the problem. We fully agree with those who feel that the Syrian crisis has gone beyond all imaginable or even unimaginable borders. The international community really has to come together so as to solve this crisis. But for the time being, there doesn't seem to be a feeling of urgency for this task for all. Someone, for the years to come, is planning the arming and training of the so-called moderate opposition. However, given incoming information, there isn't any moderate opposition. ISIS and Al-Qaeda have taken control of Syria. For any conflict, there are two solutions, a military and political one. Attempts for a military solution in lack of a Security Council veto was something we saw in Libya in 2011. The result was that the country is in free fall and sends shockwaves to the whole region of the Sahel and North Africa, and now even to the Mediterranean. Steps are still being taken for the political settlement in Syria, but are lacking consistency due to too many influential players who have priorities which have to do with their political agendas. The difficultly convened Geneva II conference was halted after just 2 short rounds of talks between the government and the opposition. Do you know why? The opposition, and those supporting it, wasn't happy that the government of Syria was insisting on the priority of joint combating of terrorist organizations. This position of the opposition was strange then, and today looks absolutely ridiculous when the whole world knows about the craziness of the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant. The Russian diplomacy over the whole Syrian crisis has been attempting to attain a halt of violence through dialogue with the government and opposition. 2 times we met in Moscow with the government and various opposition groups in Moscow. Unfortunately, these meetings didn't see the participation of the organization of opposition created and backed by some influential international players. But it would seem that that was actually the time when the international community could and should have demonstrated its unity in the political process. We're not giving up. Right now, basic hope we have has to do with the Geneva contacts planned by the Special Envoy of the Secretary General, Mr. de Mistura. We're providing him with every support possible. We hope that other conscientious members of the international community will do likewise. Madam President, as we're discussing humanitarian problems today, then we'd like to express our deep concern regarding the humanitarian situation of another country, Yemen. The conflict here could become a Syrian one. Over the past month, the situation in Yemen has worsened significantly. According to the UN, there are serious issues with the provision of water, food, and energy to people. Many residencies, schools, and medical institutions have been destroyed. 2 million children don't go to school, and about 1,000 civilians have been killed, including 115 children. I'd like to take the opportunity of the presence of Madam Amos and Cousins, and I'd like to hear an assessment of the humanitarian situation in Yemen. Thank you.